deceive. We have come into the night, thunder raising war at night. We have come into the night, thunder raising war at night. We'll fight for peace, for Ragnarok. Finger up for Ragnarok, finger up for Ragnarok, finger up for Ragnarok. Welcome to Valhalla. Finger up for Ragnarok, finger up for Ragnarok, finger up for Ragnarok. Welcome to Valhalla. I can feel it in my veins, the warrior inside of me. Finger up for Ragnarok, finger up for Ragnarok, finger up for Ragnarok. Welcome to Valhalla. The sounds of arms pierce morality. Nightfall the rain and the silence leaves. We have come into the night, thunder raising war at night. We have come into the night, thunder raising war at night. We'll fight for peace, for Ragnarok. Sail ball. Finger up for Ragnarok, finger up for Ragnarok, finger up for Ragnarok. Welcome to Valhalla. Finger up for Ragnarok, finger up for Ragnarok, finger up for Ragnarok. Welcome to Valhalla. I can feel it in my veins, the warrior inside of me. Finger up for Ragnarok, finger up for Ragnarok, finger up for Ragnarok. Welcome to Valhalla.
Well, welcome to Valhalla, and welcome to ApocatastasisInstitute. I'm John Coleman. Said school is located here on New Milford, Connecticut, USA. And we, of course, focus in the humanities. We accept students of about 15 years of age on up. All right, we're getting oriented here, proper, and we'll be right as rain. So here we go. This presentation is entitled Bad News and Good Education and the Bourgeois Collapse. We're going to develop various things I've indicated in various capacities over the past few months and few years. And we're going to look at class dynamics and talk about the fact that the world which led to mass education no longer exists. And we're in particular going to focus on the bourgeoisie and what we do going forward. Well, first things first, we need some good background music. What shall we have? We haven't done the Celtic stuff for a while. A good muscular topic, so we'll get some good muscular music here. All right, and we'll get our screen share squared away, and we'll be indeed off to the races. Now, the song, I will have the gentleman's name, the author. It was entitled Ragnarok, and I never choose the music randomly on these. Okay. Always have to be careful with the background music being too loud. It's better to be too soft than too loud. But to get it just right is what you're after. But Ragnarok in Norse mythology is, from what I understand, this time period of tremendous destruction, but also it is from this that rebirth comes. It's necessary it's a necessary stage. So it's we would say the nadar of a cycle. And here we are. What appropriate similes. Now, this image comes from the 20 and 25 film Final Destinations Bloodlines. And given the nature of that series, dealing with sudden deaths and rather gory deaths, you can imagine what's going to imminently happen to this glass floor. And whether it's the Ragnarok association or this scene from the film of impending doom, we're setting off. We are truly at the end of a cycle. Now, speaking of cycles, we are running a course here at the college in a few weeks called The Sons of Issachar, Historical Cycles and World Orders. And I encourage you to think about enrolling. And I encourage you even more so to enroll in that class. We're going to look at how the best scholars in human history from various cultures have approached this topic, whether from the perennialist or Abrahamic ideas, and we'll look at individual scholars like Ibn Khaldun, Samuel Benner, Oswald Spengler, and many others. There are different takes on the cycles of history, but cycles there be. And it's interesting. Millions of men, they live and they die, and they have no idea of these larger cycles that they're part of, and the generational attributes that we just think arise and that we are associated with and we associate with others. We just think that these are by happenstance, just like our personalities. Well, in reality, we are dealing with gears within gears. Our bodies have cycles. The natural world outside has cycles. The heavens have cycles. The soul goes through cycles. It makes sense that humans as a species and as our subcultures and nations, we go through cycles as well. So this is a rare course, and I think a very timely course, because guess what? We are at the end of a cycle. This is called the Sons of Issachar, Historical Cycles and World Orders. Now, we have a schema here to guide us along. So, as promised, the opening artist was Peyton Parrish. Speaking of generations, Peyton is a good millennial name. So there you go. I guess it's no weirder than John or Susan or whatever. All names, I suppose, are curious at the start. Anyway, Peyton Parrish is the artist. There's a music video that goes with this, and the song is called Ragnarok. For reasons mentioned, we chose that. Okay, so this presentation is Bad News and Good, Education and the Bourgeois Collapse. We're going to say goodbye to our promo, get that under our belt. The thesis we'll get into. Now, we have two parts to this. Part one, entitled When Priest Turns Atheist. And we're going to look at cycles briefly, and in particular, analyze the bourgeoisie and lay up the reality that the different characteristics of the bourgeois man no longer apply. So it only follows to reason that the world the bourgeois created, based off of their previous beliefs and practices, will no longer obtain. It will necessarily have to alter. And by alter, I mean collapse. And in particular, we're looking at formal or so-called compulsory education. We're going to also look at circles of influence, which is just kind of a schema laying out a dynamic which is adjacent to the characteristics of the bourgeois. And then we'll dip into the dawn of a post-literate society. Now, part two of this illustrious presentation is called Building on the Ashes. We'll have the song by John Denver, Inch by Inch. I believe that's a Pete Seeger song originally, or at least Pete Seeger covered it before him. Then we're going to look at piety. Piety is our ticket to rebuilding. I don't mean piety in the sense of going to your Wednesday Bible study. I don't mean piety in the sense of kissing your icon when you go into your Orthodox church. I mean piety in the way the pagans understood it. In fact, the Christian concept of piety, which is spiritualized somewhat, and we have the husk of it now, where we just have some religious ritual we associate with the word piety. To understand the full Christian virtue, we, like so much of Christianity, have to understand the pagan. These things are not in opposition. Historical Christianity did not see itself inherently in opposition with the classical world. That's a very recent, past 500 years, and that would have to get into the nature of what psychology was at play during the Reformation. And that also goes for the Catholic Reformation as well. Anyway, piety, paganly understood, is our ticket. So we have to get into that. The return to telos, we'll get into that as well. And we'll look at the four insanities, and we'll be done. So there you go. There's your intro. And now we get to our thesis. And just want to check the tech. Always got to do that. My drafting teacher, who died last year, Lord have mercy on him, was always fond when we would go on the AutoCAD drafting program. He was always fond of saying, save early, save often, because computers crash. And guess what? So do internet recording websites. And there is nothing worse than speaking into a piece of plastic for half an hour or an hour and it not recording. I will say StreamYard's pretty good with that, but it's not the only ball in the air. You have to hope the camera keeps on, that the internet doesn't trip off. There's all sorts of things here, but so far so good. All right, our thesis is that the middle class, which undergirded mass education, no longer believes in the values which created mass education. Ergo, mass education will no longer exist. And this is what we're looking at, ultimately with an eye towards, as schoolmen, as scholars, as lovers of formal learning, what's going to replace this husk of formal education? Well, ApocatastasisInstitute is going to replace it, along with many other worthy endeavors. But we get ahead of ourselves. Now, a note on this tone, the tone of voice that I'm using. If you haven't noticed, you don't hear me trashing mainstream education. I critique it in a very reserved way. There would not be an ApocatastasisInstitute if I was cool with everything in mainstream or alternative education, because I see a lot of rot in homeschool and unschool and God knows what it is that we're doing in the college world. But you'll notice the tone of voice here and elsewhere that I use is not hostile. You don't hear me talking about government brainwashing camps when I speak of public schools. Only reluctantly have I already spoken of mass education as compulsory education. The reason is we got next. Things like apokatastasis are going to replace this order. When that time comes, it behooves the replacements not to have pissed off and alienated people that we're going to need to help rebuild with us, including the professionals in the present dying order. When you and I were a little bit younger, the United States Corporation invaded, the war slaves of that organization invaded Irakia. And they toppled Irakia after having starved the people of that land. for nearly 15 years. And they made a very foolish decision. That was to forbid anyone associated with the so-called Ba'athist regime to hold offices, including military jobs, down to very menial war slave jobs in the occupation military. This did not serve the United States corporation very well at all. It alienated the occupiers. It strangled and alienated them. It exiled a huge amount of talent, and explains, I don't know if this really keeps the bastards at Bourgeois up at night, but it explains largely why the present government of Iraq is so dysfunctional, because the best and brightest ended up joining the insurgency. Anyway, we got next. That's a military simile, but it applies just for parts of the workforce as well. We must not alienate the teachers. They're going to be out of a job soon, and we look forward to hiring them and employing them to go get our coffee and this sort of thing. We got next. The Imperium, educationally, is falling, will fall necessarily will fall towards things that have been left out in the cold. Yeah, it's true. The mainstream and these bastards in the alternative have locked out, for instance, ApocatastasisInstitute, for instance, many independent scholars, for instance, this, that, and the other. And they have been like ostriches in the proverbial sense. Apparently ostriches don't do this, but in the land of Proverbs, the ostrich puts its head in the sand. Yes, it's very true. The dying educational order is like this ostrich. It is ignoring the buildings will literally fall down around them, and they're still going to be pretending that they're living in the educational world of the 1960s and 1970s. Eventually they'll come around. Most of them, I'm getting ahead of myself, aren't I? Most of them will filter off to some other jobber situation. But the ones that remain, we're going to need them to get our coffee, and we're going to need, I need to wind my tone, we're going to also need their talents, because there's going to be a lot of work ahead. That's why we need to mind our tone. Okay. So, part 1, when priest turns atheist. Now that allows me to get into a poem. And this, of course, is a reference to John Milton's Paradise Lost. Poetry is very important here at ApocatastasisInstitute. Our top shelf curricula, we'll say, is called The Project. It is our undergrad unified curricula, and right now it's in its initial stages, and eventually you'll scroll here and you can see the PDF you can download. So right now you want to join us, you can download this. It has various ways you can enroll. There's the full-time way, but there's all sorts of other manners as well. The point is, for the project, we have, like the briefery, we have a cycle of poetry that we read through again and again and again. The project is a 3-year study. However, the poetry is a 1-month study of about 250 poems, including selections from Milton's Paradise Lost. So I just want to read, I'll read the opening parts of this. Of course, this poem is interesting because the devil's kind of a suave character in it. Of man's first disobedience and the fruit of that forbidden tree, whose mortal taste brought death into the world and all our woe, with loss of Eden till one greater man restore us and regain the blissful seat. Sing, heavenly muse, that on the secret top of Oreb, or of Sinai, didst inspire that shepherd who first thought the chosen seed. In the beginning, how the heavens and the earth rose out of chaos. Or of Zion hill delighted thee more, or Siloa's brook that flowed fast over the oracle of God. I thence invoke thine aid to my adventurous song, that with no middle flight intends to soar above the Aeonian mount, while it pursues things unattempted, yet in prose or rhyme. And chiefly thou, O Spirit, that dost prefer before all temples the upright heart and pure, instruct me, for thou knowest, thou from the first wast present, and with the mighty wings outspread, dove-like sattest brooding o'er the vast abyss, and madest it pregnant. What in me is dark illumine, what is low raise and support, that to the height of this great argument I may assert eternal providence, and justify the ways of God to men. Tu autem Domine, miserere nobis. Thus are the opening words of Milton's Paradise Lost. Now there is actually, by way of trivia, there actually is a Paradise Found. There is a sequel. Paradise Lost deals with the few hours, according to Milton, that Adam and Eve were in the garden before they sinned, and the consequences of that. That's the theme of Paradise Lost. The much less read work, Paradise Found, deals with the redemption of Christ, and given the theological quirks of John Milton, that redemption is not done on the cross. It's rather done during Christ's battle in the desert with the three temptations. So you can read that. It's much shorter, by the way, than Paradise Lost. Okay. Now, the first section here is entitled When Priest Turns Atheist, and that comes from a little bit later in the opening of Paradise Lost, where, and this is appropriate to the bourgeois losing the very beliefs that created their world, particularly their educational world. So the title comes later on in Paradise Lost. Quote, "Yet who more oft than Belial," one of the devils, "in temples and at altars, when the priest turns atheist, as did Eli's sons, who filled with lust and violence the house of God," etc. So when priest turns atheist, and in fact this happens, right? There are groups in these United States, support groups, right, for men who are in ministry and they lose faith in the divine or in the Christian paradigm, right? Well, one of the problems with that is your entire livelihood and your family stability is tied up. So it's really complicated when you've made your entire life one thing and you no longer believe that one thing. And so when it comes to education, making a parallel, what happens when you have ordered an entire world in a certain direction and you as a society no longer believe the suppositions? Well, I have a visual aid for you in that department, and that has to do with a tree that I saw. And we're going to trust in the BitChute gods and cross our fingers and hope that this thing is done buffering. It appears that it is, because it's achieved 7 views. And this is something that happened to me lately. I guess I have to go to my main channel. This is our beautiful BitChute channel, where I've been frozen at about 250 subscribers for years. So much for free speech. What do the Jews say? The ADL in this country, when they try to deplatform someone, freedom of speech, yes. Freedom of reach, no. Silly, stupid goy. You can say whatever you want into the void. It doesn't mean anyone's going to see it. Well, you're watching this, and anyway. So this is a video I took the other day on the side of the road. I'll explain it myself in the recording. And I don't believe I need to have my speakers on for this, so it should just take off. Okay. I trust you can hear the audio. If you can't, I'll trust that the visuals are obvious enough. Okay, I trust that came across to you all right. So that is a simile of where we are at in many regards as a country, but not the least of which is educationally. We have this seemingly strong edifice, and yet it is coming down very, very fast. So now let's move into the nature of the bourgeoisie. So the first thing we want to notice with these people is the name. And this comes from bourg. Bourg, from the French. And we have different, prefixes or suffixes of this in other languages. In English, let's see if we can guess the meaning. Bourg in French. Berry, like Danbury, Waterbury, Simsbury. How about Berg? Gettysburg, Fredericksburg, Berg, Berry, Bourg. What do they all have in common? They all mean city. City. The bourgeoisie is the city man. It is in fact baked into the word itself, the bourgeoisie. The bourgeoisie is a social class. We associate them as an economic class, the so-called middle class. But that's not altogether accurate. Now, historically, it is true that the city man was defined by having a certain amount of capital that he could invest. So the bourgeois is the middle class that lives in commerce. He does not live by farming, neither raiding, neither warfare. He does not live by his hands. He is concerned about money. He's concerned about his investments, his little shop. Fundamentally, however, deeper than the superficial monetary classification of bourgeois, bourgeois is an attitude. To be bourgeois is primarily an attitude. There are plenty of proletariat who are bourgeois in their sentiments. And indeed, there are plenty of wealthy people who are bourgeois. In fact, as Christopher Dawson writes in an excellent article, regardless of one's religious confession, entitled Catholics and the Bourgeois Mind, Dawson points out, and he's writing this back in the 50s or 60s, he points out that by the 20th century, everyone is effectively a bourgeois, because bourgeois does not fundamentally mean the amount of money in your pocket. What bourgeois indicates is your attitude towards life. It has to do with your behaviors and your attitudes towards life. So we're going to break that down in some ways I've written, in some ways I'll elaborate on. And the simile to this, frankly, would be the concept of the Jew in Western culture. A Jew, in the Christian sense of the word, is not fundamentally someone who blows shofars and digs tunnels down in Queens and is circumcised and eats bagels all day and prays on Saturday and this sort of thing. That's not really what a Jew is, although many Jews are those things. But fundamentally, a Jew in the New Testament sense of the word is something which transcends the flesh. Many of your so-called Christians are Jews. Many atheists are Jews, and so forth. And we may even say all of us are Jews in the New Testament sense of the word, in the negative sense of that connotation, based off of certain attitudes that it seems everyone has. So when Dawson says everyone's bourgeois after World War II, well, we might say for various other reasons and overlapping reasons, everyone's a Jew. So we're not talking about the carnal. When it comes to the bourgeois, we're not talking about the carnal. Just like a Jew is not just some dude who goes to the synagogue and eats bagels. That we look deeper than the carnal. Likewise, when it comes to the bourgeoisie, we're looking deeper than the amount of money in his pocket. This carnality is largely secondary, if not even irrelevant. What's the essence, the ens, ENS, the very fundamental reality is the attitudes of life that the bourgeois have. It is deeper than the physical, deeper than the monetary. Although we will add here that one of the attitudes of the bourgeois is fundamentally materialistic, commercial, for reasons having to do with the order of bourgeois society. We'll get to that. Now, forever and a day, people have noticed that the bourgeois has a distinct future preference. The bourgeois will forego immediate pleasures for future boons. And when it comes to education, we can see that. And this gave rise to a certain discipline that we associated, even a certain waspy ninnyism that we might associate with the bourgeois. The bourgeois, of course, is Protestant, religiously, historically, and certainly psychologically. And I've written about this before. You may go on our staff publication page, which is our October focus, incidentally, on our website at the Institute. If you go up to the top, you'll see the monthly feature. Right. I need to upgrade this. It's certainly on the emails. Mea culpa. Can't do it all. Try as I might, you can't do it all. Anyway, by the time you watch this, the October feature will be the staff publications, and you can see, anyhow, an essay I wrote called "Psychology is Not Religion." So, likewise, just like Jewish or bourgeois is not material, likewise, to be a Protestant is more of a psychological designation than any sort of religious confessional affiliation. And we could also say, though, with great truth, that the bourgeois historically gave rise to the religious movement called Protestantism. Protestantism was hand in glove, right, white on rice, horse and carriage, whatever, Jack and Jill. Protestantism cannot, as a religious movement, ever be separated from the bourgeois. And in fact, Protestantism would never have gotten off the ground, much less found attraction, if it were not for the bourgeois. Protestantism, if you follow, you read books like The Reformation by the Durants there, the purple book. I don't know if you can see this here. Right, this is a good introduction. Right, the entire Protestant Reformation, of which we're coming up to the anniversary, the 506th anniversary, 507th anniversary of the 1517 Reformation. I'm sure my math is off there, but it's coming up, because in October, of course, the Protestants have their Reformation Day. So, if you do read that book, it's a good one, you will know that Protestantism primarily grew in middle-class environments, largely having to do with the Catholic Church's stance on usury and things that are beyond our time here. The point is, though, Protestantism was once a feature of the bourgeois. Oh, by the way, if you didn't notice here in capital letters, none of these points exist anymore. Actually, I would say here, what I'm going to say, some of these thinking on the sly, some of these no longer exist anymore. Can we settle there? Okay. I would say the things of discipline, for instance, when we get to circles of influence, I'll just tip my hat here. When we get to circles of influence, we'll see that a lot of the qualities, I would think the good qualities of the bourgeoisie that gave rise naturally to compulsory education, so-called, a lot of those no longer exist. I would say still that the bourgeois are principally an attitude and that they are principally materialistic in their concerns. They are no longer future-oriented because of the effects of telephonia. They are no longer religiously Protestant, although psychologically they are, particularly when it comes to a certain paranoia. And we'll get to that a little bit down the line. But another feature of the bourgeois, historically, is the confusion of material prosperity with spiritual wealth. And this has to do because of the religious association of the middle class with Protestantism, therefore the focus on the Old Testament as opposed to the New Testament. And so in the Old Testament patriarchs, very often they will be rewarded with material boon, which is an old term for success, as a sign of God's favor. And that enters into, of course, Protestant societies. Is it Max Weber who writes the Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism, where he really lays this out? And you don't need Max Weber to do so, because here in these United States we have mega churches and we have the health and wealth gospel, which very, very clearly packages spirituality in capitalistic terms. And actually, there's another essay by Weber that people don't talk about and was actually kind of difficult for me to get my hands on. And that's, let's see, America and Protestant Sects. And he gets into the capitalistic nature of religion in America, even outside of Christianity altogether. That in America, there's a situation where since there's no state sponsorship of denominations and faiths, basically all the religions are on a type of competitive footing. And so that has interesting outworkings, and Weber has an essay on that point. Anyhow, that confusion is an aspect of Protestantism, yes, but of the bourgeois more importantly, because that secularizes, right? That association, and that just secularizes in the sense of a type of Benthamite idea that the wealthy are morally, Jeremy Bentham, right, would be a great example of that secularized prejudice, where the ruling classes are just assumed to be morally superior, and if you're poor, you must be up to no good. Those are the social outworkings. Enter your war on drugs and all of this war on poverty, and really war on poor people, because poor people are spiritually inferior even in a secularized society. You see how this has outworkings, right? Now the bourgeois, this is another thing that is very much the case. So, see, this is why I had to correct up here. So some of these are no longer at play. Some of them are. Some of them have mutated. So one aspect of the bourgeoisie, which very much is present, is they have no inherent self-sufficiency. They're physically weak, and even the ones who are physically strong have to pay other bourgeois to go to their exercise clubs. But the bourgeois cannot build. He doesn't know how to really do anything at all except other bourgeois jobs. He cannot make his own food. He cannot hunt. The bourgeois cannot start a fire. The bourgeois cannot defend himself. He needs a legal system that he doesn't understand to allegedly defend him. The bourgeois is completely dependent on the bourg. That's why he's bourgeois, right? He's completely dependent on the city, literally, to survive. He cannot make his own clothes. He cannot make his own food. He cannot make his own house, etc., etc. The bourgeois is completely dependent on other bourgeois. And so it is this house of cards. Another interesting aspect of this class, which we may say encompasses nearly all of people, is that for the bourgeois, his neighbor is both his customer, whom he must ingratiate himself with, he must suck up to, and his competitor. And this creates the paranoid aspect of the bourgeois, which you see in endless social panics over the last 500 years, whether that's witches, whether that's terrorists, whether that's, that's why there are Ring cameras everywhere. That's why the bourgeois loves background checks. The bourgeois' greatest, pretend you're Tony the Tiger. It's great, right? You have to put a lot of R's into it. What is the greatest bourgeois pleasure is finding peccadillos and eccentricities, particularly sexually, in his neighbor. The bourgeois is obsessed. That's also, I would absolutely say, the bourgeois is absolutely obsessed about sexual propriety. And you say, well, that's a good thing. Propriety. Actually, did I spell that right? Oh, alhamdulillah. Obsessed with, well, sexual propriety. With two caveats. Okay, one caveat is that the peccadillos are not my peccadillos, right? You'll win them all. You can't get all the spelling right. Peccadillos are okay. Peccadi. Okay, are not my peccadillos. So the bourgeois, for instance, to use a great example, will constantly gripe about sodomy for some reason, and we can fantasize and theorize all day. For some reason, the bourgeois are very concerned about homosexuality, which is a type of sodomy. But the bourgeois are not particularly concerned about the sodomy that they commit, such as masturbation or contraceptives. Those are also sodomic acts. And yet you go to your middle-class 501c3 corporate whore church, and they've redefined the word sodomy to mean one sexual peccadillo, which they can all beat up on, and not others. People who have sterilized themselves and proceed with a marital act. That's also sodomy. Sodomy is a very big concept. And actually, one of the reasons the bourgeois is obsessed with sexual propriety that they happen to not, the peccadillos that they're not into. Part of that reason actually does go back to the Reformation. And the fact is that to have the Reformation, you get to have usury. And so the entire ancient and medieval Christian world, which was predicated on fighting usury and greed, and that was considered the worst sin, all of that's toppled with capitalism, and greed is good, as Gordon Gekko reminds us. And so in these bourgeois religions, and again, I really don't want to get caught up on the theology or the creedal statements. When I say that the bourgeois is Protestant, these are largely psychologies. Pretty much every Roman Catholic, pretty much every Eastern Orthodox in the West holds to this Protestantism and to capitalism, right? So don't get angry at me. If you're a Muslim, actually, you would a Jew, if you're secular. I mean, these are much more fundamental realities than just, verbal rituals and creeds. So if it sounds like I'm picking on Protestants, I'm not. I'm just using these as almost archetypes that affect really all of us in various degrees. And so at the Reformation, the Christian order was toppled. Might want to ask who was behind the Reformation, but that's not appropriate to this presentation altogether. You can guess. Sometimes they dig tunnels in Queens. But the point is, what was going to replace it as the ultimate sin, greed and pride, which you need for your secular capitalistic world in the early modern period to today. Those are the virtues of this system, of this kingdom. So what becomes the vices becomes a sexual propriety, because sexual propriety violates another aspect of the bourgeois, the future preference. So that's why in the bourgeois, they're always obsessed about who's having affairs, what are the sexual crimes or sins of others. Did my preacher, my pastor, the teacher, the coach, the town mayor, did the mayor of Candor lie? Anyone get that reference? You can go and look up that song. Did the mayor of Candor lie? Right? The bourgeois is obsessed about the most morbid and disgusting sexual peccadillos, as long as they're not his. Fundamentally, the bourgeois is anti-pious, which we'll get into in the second half of this presentation. What is piety? Okay, so those are the characteristics. And you say, what the hell does any of that have to do with education? Because all of these things, when these were robust and seriously believed, some of them have degenerated, right? The confusion of material prosperity with spiritual wealth has secularized and degenerated into a type of class war, the police state, Benthamite management of society, the panopticon, right? That would be, a degeneration of an error, or maybe the proper flowering of an error. The paranoia of having Ring cameras and background checks everywhere. That's the logical fruit, I suppose. But you can say it's a degeneration as well of the customer-competitor confusion that creates this spirit of paranoia. The focus on, and I use that word advisedly, the obsession about sexual propriety, to the absence, it would seem, of almost every other aspect of the moral life for the bourgeois, has entered its late stage, let's say. But what were the good things? What were the things, as we move to the circle of influence, what type of society does the bourgeois produce? So I've obviously been very critical, but I need to point out especially future preference that can produce a great amount of discipline, this focus on goals and on executing the goals. Another aspect stemming especially from Protestantism is being involved in your society. It's out of Protestant societies, particularly radical Presbyterian Protestant societies and Puritan societies, that you get these early Republican movements. In fact, John Milton, already referenced, was very much a Republican. He was writing at the time of the English Civil War, after all, with Cromwell. So part of the bourgeois, we could add this, is this idea of being self-directed, coming out of Protestantism, coming out of this idea of you have to take your salvation seriously. Christianity becomes an individual thing. And again, that too secularizes. So the individual Christian soul who has to make a personal commitment to Christ, has to read his Bible to see what God is saying to him, right? You see the individuality. The individual soul can weigh in on doctrines and can, as Luther says at the Council of Worms, make personal judgments based off of the testimony of the Holy Spirit in the individual Christian soul. Well, all of this itself secularizes into democratic institutions, including the school. So this brings us now back to education. So how is it that the bourgeois gave way to mass education? Well, it really does come out of this idea in the Reformation of, now we're getting to the nitty-gritty of this. Yes, the individual is responsible for himself. He can no longer just be a Christian going to mass on Sunday. He's part of this church that's sacramentally save him in these mystical rituals. The new bourgeois Christian has to make a personal application to Christ to have God apply the graces to his soul. So there's this very individualistic strain in bourgeois society that necessarily in this 17th and 18th and 19th centuries presses on the political organization of bourgeois society. It has democratized religion. It will now democratize politics, and this is the rise of liberalism, which is a bourgeois fruit. And so the bourgeois not only gets to elect his pastor, but the bourgeois now can also elect his mayor, his governor, his king, his president, whatever. This is the natural outworking. And this individuality also applies then to other things in society. The petty bourgeois store, the shopkeeper, with the vision and hopes of the shopkeeper, which are notoriously limited. So, when it comes to the bourgeois democracy, one of the safeguards, especially in these United States, was going to be the educated population. So if you know the American system, you know that it is the compilation of many, many previous political regimes. We all know about Greece and Rome. I think we all got that. If you didn't get the hint, you can just check out your civil buildings in this country and your monuments, which are very much inspired by the Greco-Roman. But also other influences, the Iroquois Confederacy, for instance, the Republic of Venice, and some of these other Italian republics during the medieval period, the Holy Roman Empire, the Hanseatic League. By no means was America the first republic, and by no means was it, in fact, the first republic since Greece or Rome. There have been many, many attempts at these type of organizations. What made the American situation interesting is that it kind of combined a lot of these previous systems. And the emergency valve, and you can see this in other versions of liberalism throughout the world, but especially in America, the emergency valve of preventing the degeneration of the republic into an autocracy, which happened to every single other republic in history, was going to be the educated and engaged populace. This was the bulwark. This was the emergency brake. This the individual, getting back to the middle class sentiments, the individual, educated, engaged in his society, engaged in reading his newspaper, engaged in his church, engaged in his softball league, taking ownership of his society. This was going to be the unique American provision against the degeneration of democracy. Hence, and you can even see this hard-boiled into the U.S. Constitution, I think it's Article 3, where the United States federal government, one of the justifications it gives for existing is to further the arts and sciences. Well, why is that? Well, they just like the arts and sciences? Well, no. The reason is there was supposed to be a practical application. The reason the state runs libraries and, public media like PBS, NPR, the reason it runs things like schools, colleges, trade schools, adult education, retraining and job skills, is because it's part of the MO of the state to do that. Why? Because, again, coming all around circle, because the engaged citizen was to be the defense against the oligarchy taking over. Now, for a whole slew of reasons, some of which were self-inflicted, others of which were engineered, following the Second World War, all of this was kicked out. All of this engagement in society was eroded, kicked out, or whatever. And so the world which gave rise, the bourgeois world, good and bad, which gave rise to mass education, by the 21st century, we're now a quarter of the way through that century, the institutions continue to exist. Everyone goes to school, but the beliefs in it no longer exist. And therefore, the structures necessarily, like that tree that I showed you before, the structures necessarily have to come down. And you're seeing that in all sorts of ways. So just to be clear, if I haven't been clear already, this is regarding, childcare, but this is applicable to, adults as well, and social institutions. But, just look at a student here, in this case, envisioned as a little child. The child is in the center here. This is their world, okay? This is our world as children. And then you have these microsystems, the immediate family of the child, the play circle of the child, the neighborhood of the child that he toddles about in, if children still do toddle about, because the paranoia of the bourgeois is so much that they don't even go outside anymore. But anyway, we'll save the commentary. The point is, right, the individual youth has these immediate circles. And then beyond them, he has his friends and neighborhood, his workplace, his community health services, for example, his extended family, his aunties and uncles and grandpa. And then beyond that, you have the values of the society, the laws of the society, the customs of the land, right? These are the larger things. And what's happened since the Second World War is that those larger circles have been slowly eroding. And so the externals continue. There are still churches, there are still schools, there are still jobs and the assumptions we take to jobs, but the larger world, which gave rise to those things as we understand them, and the assumptions that were connected in 1,000 ways to a world which created those have been ebbing away for the past 80 years. Getting to the idea of cycles. Now, I'm not going to redo the fourth turning discussion. If you're interested, I had some fun lately, although it was kind of a slog to record, looking at the Charlie Kirk event, let's just call it, and the Neil and Howe fourth turning concept. Here's a diagram of one person's take on it. But if you take the cycles course that I mentioned, you'll get into St. Augustine, Ibn Khaldun, and Spengler, and Neil and Howe as well. There are different ways, but just taking the fourth turning idea, they point out that you have a crisis. We'll just start it up here, right? You have a crisis moment. Then you have a high. There's a cultural high. Then there's an awakening, and then an unraveling, and a crisis, and then you just go through those cycles, which run about 80 years. They do not run exactly 80 years. Don't play the game of what if, but what about, but what about, but what about. They run roughly 80 years in different nations. Sometimes the nations hit the same crises at the same time. That's where you get your world wars, for example. In any case, we are in the unraveling time. In fact, we are entering, according to this one, The unraveling took place from 1985 to about 2005, and the crisis is from 2005 to 2025. You can wonder, why is it you keep hearing all this stuff about 2030s? Why are all these nations getting ready for a big war? Right? Because they know these cycles. So the point is, you also have this aspect of generations. If you look on the right, the artist, the prophet, the nomad, and the hero. And these two also cycle. So just like the four turnings cycle in the big events of our lives and our generations, likewise, each generation in this model can be associated with one of these archetypes. Now, getting back to our cycles, or rather our circles of influence, what's been happening, how do you eat out these institutions, especially education, is because of these larger cycles. So you can be raising your child completely unaware to this, and yet you can see over the generations things from the outside slowly, the assumptions on the outside, because it's the outside ones that go through the visible turnings, right? The laws and the values and the customs and the big historical events, I would add. These are on the outside circle of influence. Those trickle down into the exosystem, as this schematic has it: friends and neighborhood, workplace, extended family, and eventually those trickle down into the individual child. And so you have this, we used to say, knock-on effect. You have things that are happening on the outside, and it takes a while in the macro system. It takes decades sometimes for that to come into the exosystem and for that to finally trickle down into the microsystem. And that's what you're seeing fundamentally when it comes to formal education, is that the middle class discipline and hopes and future preference that gave birth to compulsory education, that has eaten out because of the paranoia of the middle class, which has grown, the isolation and individualism, the collapse of capitalism as a viable way to keep body and soul together, if it ever was, right? The fact that you're having, it's becoming too hard to cover up anymore that this economic system is falling apart. We're pretending that it's fine. The stock market is through the roof. People can't afford groceries. They can't afford rent because Blackwater's sucking up all the properties, putting their finger on the scale of that. Everything's shifting over to a subscription model. Neo-feudalism is coming, and yet you have a almost entrepreneurial 1930s understanding of why you go to school. Yet that world no longer exists, but now it's trickling down the generations, and more people cannot be quiet about it. And so you're seeing that, again, these are on the outsides coming in. So you're seeing that now in these United States with a drop-off of college enrollment for various reasons we've talked about before. You're seeing that with the rise, ultimately, of anti-intellectualism. You're seeing that with just fundamentally the educational system was always, with various degrees of wallpaper on top of it, was always calibrated economically. Well, those economics, forget about college loans and all that stuff. I'm just saying the world that was supposed to train you for a job, which is what the middle class only wanted their education for to begin with, that world no longer exists. And that's going to quickly come down with AI and robotics and things. It's a whole other discussion. The point is, you almost need to see these circles of influence and how they're affecting us almost as a drain. In your bathtub, on the outside, goes down the drain, you pull the plug, and the water on the outside is very slow. But the more you get to the suction, the faster you get. And it's like this, right? These are the circles of influence. The outside moves very slowly, but it inevitably will catch up to the middle strata. And finally, when it does catch up, the social changes, when they do catch up to the individual and their individual micro system, it's very fast. And so when that happens, then you see the externals collapse quickly. And that's what you will see with the formal education. So there we go. This is why you study cycles. Now, I want to get into an excellent article here, The Dawn of the Post-Literate Society. And we'll take a little bit of a break and come back for our conclusions. This is appearing on Substack. I will link this down below. The Dawn of the Post-Literate Society and the End of Civilization by James Merritt. See a burning of the books here, which is interesting. We associate that with Nazi Germany. And yet, when the Allies conquered Germany, they destroyed books. Actually, they destroyed a lot more books than the Nazis ever did. I'll say that again. The liberals from Britain and America and France, who conquered the Nazis in the West, destroyed, no doubt with the communists, a huge amount of German literature, but they did not do it with fire, but rather they had giant blenders. There were giant Allied blenders that went around Germany, pulping entire libraries. And so burning and destroying books is more than just a Nazi occupation. All right, so we're not going to read every word of this, but our man here, Merritt, begins, "It was one of the most important revolutions of modern history, yet no blood was spilled, no bombs were thrown, and no monarch was beheaded. Perhaps no great social transformation has ever been carried out so quietly. This one took place in armchairs, in libraries, in coffee houses, and in clubs. What happened was this. In the middle of the 18th century, huge numbers of ordinary people began to read. For the first couple of centuries after the invention of the printing press, reading remained largely an elite pursuit. But by the beginning of the 1700s, the expansion of education and an explosion of cheap books began to diffuse reading rapidly down through the middle classes and even into the lower ranks of society. Oh my goodness, wow. It's almost like there are circles of influence at play. Huh, how interesting. What an illustrative example. Suddenly, it seemed, right? So look, circles of influence, right? On the outside, reading is changing. And finally it comes to the microsystem 250 years later. And then suddenly it seems like everyone's reading, right? The drain gets faster the closer you get into it. People alive at the time understood that something momentous was going on. Suddenly it seemed that everyone was reading everywhere. Men, women, children, the rich, the poor. Reading began to be described as a fever, an epidemic, a craze, a madness. As the historian Tim Blanning writes, quote, conservatives were appalled and progressives were delighted that it was a habit that knew no social boundaries. This transformation is sometimes known as the reading revolution. It was an unprecedented democratization of information, the greatest transfer of knowledge into the hands of ordinary men and women in history. In Britain, only 6,000 books were published in the first decade of the 18th century. In the last decade of the same century, the number of new titles was in excess of 56,000. More than 500,000 new publications appeared in German over the course of the 1700s. The historian Simon Schama has gone so far as to write that, quote, literacy rates in the 18th century France were much higher than in the late 20th century United States. Where readers had once read intensively, spending their lives reading and rereading 1 or 2 or 3 books, the reading revolution popularized a new kind of extensive reading. People read everything they could get their hands on: newspapers, journals, histories, philosophy, science, theology, and literature. The novel, I'll interject, the novel is a perfect creature of this time period. It's perfectly middle class in all sorts of ways. The individuality of it, the time blocking that you need to get through novels, the intense self-psychologizing of novels. Books, pamphlets we go on to read in these genres, periodicals poured off the presses. It was an age of monumental works. Now I'm just going to skip down here to give us some examples. Even more importantly, print changed how people thought. The world of print is orderly, logical, and rational, just like the bourgeois typically were up until telephonic media. Telephony has greatly undermined the discipline of the middle class, a discipline you need if you're going to have mass education. It has greatly undermined the discipline of the middle. At the same time, it has exacerbated what arguably are the weaknesses of the middle class, or has turned things that were benign about the middle class into weaknesses, such as especially the inherent paranoia of the customer-competitor dynamic. But the one thing it has, telephonic media, instant TikTok gratification, instant porno gratification, instant DoorDash, gustatory gratification. This has completely eviscerated the future preference. This is gone from the middle class. Future preference, you see my cursor? Future preference is completely gone from the middle class. And that undermines every aspect of middle class education. And by the way, this also applies not just to mass education, like the mass colleges or public schools, but it also applies to other bourgeois fruits, such as homeschooling. And this is the fruit for another discussion for another day. But it's occurred to me, while I went down this route with ApocatastasisInstitute, which is not a homeschooling thing, but it, you kind of look to fellow travelers and you see other people in the alternative so-called education, so-called world, and you kind of think you have a simpatico. And then over 20 years, I realized I have nothing in common with homeschoolers, because I went down this route of, going off the reservation, let's say, because I was appalled at the sloppiness in both mainstream and so-called alternative education. And it was academic excellence which has always been driving me as a professional. And then it takes, sometimes 20 years to discern that, for instance, with homeschooling, that's not why they're doing it. They're just as sloppy as the mainstream. In fact, they may, part of the rise of homeschooling, I must do a whole presentation on this, but I do believe part of the rise of homeschooling actually is a desire to be more sloppy. And that's very obvious if you know their intellectual rigor, let's say, their classroom rigor. It's far worse than even the cruddy mainstream schools, public and private. It too, even this reform movement, it too is a sign of the decay. It is actually part of the quickening. And that's why when I say that bourgeois education is going to collapse, I'm not just talking about public schools. I'm not just talking about colleges. I'm saying the whole thing, including homeschool, including private school, is going to collapse so fast you won't believe it, because nobody's there anymore forget about the life of the mind. They're not even there for the discipline of having a job or a career. right? The assumptions that these things would yield stability materially are not there. So logically, you can't expect future preference just to last forever, especially when you have, again, the inundation of telephonic media, which has, in the most crass fashion, hacked our present preference, let's call it, our desire for instant gratification, for dopamine hits from various sources. There's not that many sources, right? Social approval, thumbs up, your stomach, your willy, and I don't know what else. I don't know, your eyeballs for movies or whatever. I mean, basically, you can. I understand the Chinese have color coded all the politicians they've compromised, and they only have 3 colors, right? Yellow is for hanky panky, green was for money, and I think blue was for drugs, and that was it, right? The CCP has figured out, like the devil has a long time before, that it doesn't take much, right, to topple a man or a woman. But future preference, anyhow, future preference has been completely eaten out by telephonia, and by just the fact that capitalism has entered its terminal stage, and no longer can credibly offer the things to the society it once promised, and the society no longer believes it. Okay. So, yes, reading, getting back to the world which gave rise to the schools, the world of print is orderly, logical, and rational. In books, knowledge is classified, comprehended, connected, and put into its place. Books make arguments, prose, theses. These develop ideas. To engage with the written word, Neil Postman writes, means to follow a line of thought, which requires considerable powers of classifying, inference making, and reasoning. As Postman pointed out, it is no accident that the growth of print culture in the 18th century was associated with the growing prestige of reason, hostility to superstition, the birth of capitalism, and the rapid development of science. Other historians have linked the 18th century explosion of literacy to the Enlightenment, the birth of human rights, the arrival of democracy, and even the beginnings of the Industrial Revolution. The world as we know it was forged in the reading revolution, and I'm going to say the reading revolution was forged in the assumptions and values of a previous instantiation of the middle class. Those values no longer exist. That world, including in the school, can no longer exist. And when that drain finally catches up to the inner circle, it will be very fast. The counter-revolution. Now, this fellow Merritt says, now we are living through the counter-revolution. More than 300 years, cycles of history, more than 300 years after the reading revolution ushered in a new era of human knowledge. Books are dying. Numerous studies show that reading is in free fall. Even the most pessimistic 20th century critics of the screen age would have struggled to predict the scale of the present crises. In America, reading for pleasure has fallen by 40% in the last 20 years. In the UK, more than a third of adults say they have given up reading. The National Literacy Trust reports shocking and dispiriting falls in children's reading, which is now at its lowest level on record. Why? Because finally, the assumptions have trickled down to the parents. The parents no longer encourage reading. That used to be a very definitive sign of the middle class, is that your parents were always on your back to keep reading, keep learning. The parents now no longer believe that, because the entire world which gave rise to those values has unraveled. And that's what's happening. Go online. There's a great YouTube channel called Teacher Therapy. And this lady is just interviewing teachers who are leaving the profession or have left. And that's one of the big things now, is the lack of discipline. And what you're seeing fundamentally, why is it? Because again, these cycles on these circles of influence as well, that you've had the unraveling of manners, you've had the unraveling of discipline, and now this is coming to the point now that the parents of the children in schools don't have any more discipline. I can tell you, certainly don't have any more comportment or self-respect. And so that's leading to huge behavior problems in the public, private, and homeschool worlds, because the discipline is gone. The foundations, as we sing in the Psalms, in the Liturgy of the Hours, the foundations once destroyed, what can the just do? I believe that's Psalm 125, 126. Foundations once destroyed, what can the just do? Discipline, once you lose it, as St. Basil says in his rule, you don't get it back. And if you do, Dante's a little bit more optimistic. If you do, it's a long journey back. Basil says he's never known a monk, he's never known a man, in fact, who fasted and was in the discipline of fasting and stopped his asceticism and came back. That's Basil the Great. Dante, like I say, you can come back, but it's a tough row to hoe, to our interlude song. So the collapse is coming. The collapse is coming in many ways, like this tree. It's coming also educationally. And so in part 2, I want to talk about what will replace this order, and a lot of that's going to have to do with piety. So with that, we'll knock off and we shall return.
Inch by inch, row by row, gonna make this garden grow. All it takes is a rake and a hoe and a piece of fertile ground. Inch by inch, row by row, someone bless these seeds I sowed. Someone warm them from below till the rain comes tumbling down. Pulling weeds and picking stones, man is made of dreams and bones. Feel the need to grow my own, 'cause the time is close at hand. Grain for grain, sun and rain, find my way in nature's chain. Tune my body and my brain to the music of the man. Inch by inch, row by row. Plant your rows straight and long, temper them with prayer and song. Mother Earth will make you strong if you give her love and care. Old Bro watching hungrily from his perch in yonder tree. In my garden I'm as free as that feathered thief up inch by inch, row by row. Inch by inch, row by row, gonna make this garden grow. All it takes is a rake and a hoe and a piece of fertile ground. Inch by inch, row by row, someone bless these seeds I sow. Someone warm them from below till the rain comes tumbling down. Till the rain comes tumbling down. Inch by inch, row by row.
What a treasure John Denver was. What a treasure. He died far too early. I remember that being in the press. I was a little boy, but anyhow, here we are. That was, of course, John Denver's cover, at least, of Inch by Inch. Okay. Back on the wagon here for part 2. And we'll just get queued up here with our camera and screen share. It'll be great to get going. This is part 2. I just want to resume with the article and transition to our main focus, which is rebuilding. What's going to replace this order now that the bourgeois assumptions, some of them good, some of them bad, but it doesn't matter, they're going away anyhow. So what's going to replace this, and what's going to be the key to this work? I'm going to say it's piety, so we'll get there, but I'll just continue. Now I've skipped ahead some. You can access this down below in the description. The next section in the Merit article is an intellectual tragedy. The collapse of reading is driving declines in various measures of cognitive ability. Reading is associated with a number of cognitive benefits, including improved memory and attention span, better analytical thinking, improved verbal fluency, and lower rates of cognitive decline in later life. When you hear me say people are getting dumber, I'm not being funny completely. After the introduction of smartphones in the mid-2010s, global PISA scores, the most famous international measure of student ability, began to decline. As John Byrne Murdoch writes in the Financial Times, students increasingly tell surveys that they struggle to think, learn, and concentrate. We will notice the telltale mid-2010s inflection point. Quote, the Monitoring and Future study has been asking 18-year-olds whether they have difficulty thinking, concentrating, or learning new things. The share of final year high school students who report difficulties was stable throughout the 1990s and 2000s, and then began a rapid upward climb in the mid-2010s. Golly, I wonder why. What happened? What happened in 2011 to set all of these numbers careening to the ground? Want to guess? Right? The iPhone. You knew that. And as Byrne Murdoch says, these cognitive issues are not restricted to schools and universities. They affect everyone. The decline in measures of reasoning and problem solving is not confined to teenagers. The adults show a similar pattern, with declines visible across all age groups. So the outside world, which gave rise to schools, reading culture, self-improvement, all of those things which are fruits in their way of middle-class future preference, now they're catching up. They're also being given by the early part of this century. They're also giving a huge shove by manipulative concerns such as Silicon Valley. And so, again, when the quickening happens, it happens fast. These move slowly, but they do catch up, just like a spring on a clock. Now I'm really dating myself. Most intriguing and alarming is the case of IQ, which rose consistently throughout the 20th century, which now seems to have begun to fall. The result is not only the loss of information and intelligence, but a tragic impoverishing of the human experience. For a century, almost all educated and intelligent people have believed that literature and learning are among the highest purposes and deepest consolations of human existence. The classics have been preserved over the centuries because they contain, in Matthew Arnold's famous phrase, the best that has been taught and said. The greatest novels and poems enrich our sense of human experience by imaginatively putting us inside other minds and taking us to other times and other places. Reading nonfiction, science, history, philosophy, travel writing, we become deeply acquainted with our place in the extraordinary and complicated world we are privileged to inherit. Smartphones are robbing us of these consolations. The epidemic of anxiety, depression, and purposelessness afflicting young people in the 21st century is often linked to isolation and negative social comparison fostered by smartphones. Now, it's not for nothing if we go back to what defines the bourgeois and that gave rise to mass education. I say some of these, after our correction earlier on, some of these no longer exist. Well, one of the things that no longer exist is Protestant faith in the formal sense. and it's largely been replaced by secularism. And so part of the reason future preference, which you need for an extended educational career, curriculum, part of the reason you can discipline yourself for that is inspired by the religious discipline you have in Protestant Christianity. And so when that goes away in the mid-20th century, as a lot of the Protestant denominations secularized, a lot of that hope, a lot of that discipline also goes away. And so you can see how this, therefore, would affect the discipline of education, and why that also is not valued as much. It's taken as people are resentful for it. Parents are resentful. Students are resentful that they have to jump through their hoops. I mentioned this. I've alluded to this. I will do a full show on this at some point. What's fueling homeschooling is not academic excellence. It is a juvenile resentment of authority. That's what's underneath it. It took me a long time to figure that out. Why could I never fit in with those people? Because when you're interested in academic excellence and you're constantly encountering people that are just mentally and spiritually approaching you like a sophomore in high school and they're pissy, well, of course you're not going to. I'm not talking about high school sophomore. I'm talking about adult parents, so-called, that have this very sophomoric relationship with authority. And it is this juvenile attitude which is fueling homeschooling. It is this stick it to the man type of attitude. It took me a long time to realize that. And a lot of that's coming from the unraveling of discipline, because we are no longer a Protestant middle class psychology in the ways that was very good. You could argue that it led to that discipline. Okay, so let's just cut to the chase here, and then we'll get to the next remarks. It's a very long article, a very worthwhile one, I'll tell you. So this is going to have knock-on effects. And we have the next section, the death of democracy. Amusingly, from the perspective of the present, the reading revolution of the 18th century was accompanied not only by excitement, but by a moral panic. No lover of tobacco or coffee, no wine drinker or lover of games can be as addicted to their pipe, bottle games, or coffee table as those many hungry readers are to their reading habits, thundered one German clergyman. Richard Steele feared that novels raise expectations which the ordinary course of life can never realize. Others fretted that reading excites the imagination too much and fatigues the heart. So this is just like now, maybe I share in this, maybe you do, we have a moral panic about smartphones and how they're changing society. Well, look, people back in the day had the same wariness about reading. So that's kind of ticklish. Nothing new under the sun. Cycles, get it? Cycles. So moral panics are cycles too, but that's beside the point. What's on point is that the system worked in an age before mass literacy. He's talking about the medieval world. But as knowledge spread through society and the analytic critical modes of thinking fostered by print took hold, the whole mental and cultural atmosphere which sustained the old order was burned away. People began to know too much and to think too much. The feudal order seems to be fundamentally incompatible with literacy. The historian Orlando Figes has noted that the English, French, and Russian revolutions were all occurring in societies in which literacy was approaching 50%. So I'm going to ask you where this author is going. He'll tell us, but I'm going to ask you, what do you think happens in a society which is predicated on mass education and reading, which is no longer interested in those things? Not only is the formal structures going away, but ultimately, one of the knock-on effects of that is also the political organization, which is predicated on that rationality and that engagement, will go away. In a ham-fisted way, that's what you're seeing in people who are wary about fascism in America. What they're bumping up against, maybe in ways that I wouldn't phrase it, but what they're seeing is this reality. Although I think it's a little bit myopic where they're taking it. But what's present is you're sinking back, as this author will say elsewhere, from an almost from a rational, logical, educated world, by and large, middle class, back into the pre-literate, or in this case, post-literate, mind, which is the mind of mysticism and emotion. That's what's fueling the populism. People get too caught up on the individual figures and debates of the day to realize some of these deeper circles of influence. How do you get populism? Well, by having 80 years of the post-World War II order, the bourgeois order, slowly and then faster and faster changing. That's how you end up with a populist movement, not just here in these United States, but elsewhere, where there's all sorts of, shall we say, appeals to emotion at play. These are fundamentally magical ways of conducting one's mental life. In Amusing Ourselves to Death, Neil Postman argues that democracy and print are virtually inseparable. An effective democracy presupposes a reasonably informed and somewhat critical citizenry capable of understanding and debating the issues of the day in detail and at length. Democracy draws immeasurable strength from print, the old dying world of books, newspapers, and magazines, with its tendency to foster deep knowledge, logical argument, critical thought, objectivity, and dispassionate engagement. In environment, ordinary people have the tools to understand their rulers, to criticize them, and perhaps to change them. Okay. And I'll just end here and make my points. Politics in the age of short-form video favors highlighted emotion, ignorance, and uneven assertions. This is what has replaced the middle-class educational discipline. Heightened emotion, ignorance, and unevidenced assertions. I think I might have mispronounced that word, unevidenced. Such circumstances are highly propitious for charismatic charlatans. Inevitably, parties and politicians hostile to democracy are flourishing. In the post-literate world, TikTok usage correlates with increased vote share for populist parties and the far right, and I would also say the far left, and just things of that ilk. God, you got to be careful with that, like far right and far left. God knows what that is. They'd say MAGA is far right. Okay, so I recommend you read this. This is an excellent article. Once again, it's entitled "The Dawn of the Post-Literate Society and the End of Civilization" by James Merritt. It's down below in the description. Okay. So I hope I've made my point where I see the educational world going. Okay, what's going to be the solution is piety. Piety is devotion to the past, devotion to ancestors, devotion to the ideals that made you personally and your society great. Piety presupposes stability. That is going to be a hard sobriety. For those of us who are serious about building on the ashes of this society is done. It is over. This world, this cycle is over. What that over looks like, we can talk about how that will come about. The powers that be in this world are absolutely, I read their trade publications like Foreign Affairs, they are absolutely convinced there will be a major war, not Ukraine. Ukraine is a major war if you're involved in it, God help us, but a World War II level engagement. I mean, that's what this whole world right now is sharpening. I don't know if you get that on your TikTok. I don't know if you get that in your news media. I don't know if you understand what's happening. But this world, across the world, the nations, the civil states are sharpening their knives for a huge conflict. Arguably, it's already begun. Ukraine is a theater. Gaza is a theater. The Red Sea in Yemen is a theater. But, for instance, if you follow the war in Ukraine closely, one of the reasons things have developed that way is because Russia is holding almost everything in reserve. Russia knows this is not the real war. What's happening in Ukraine is not that's the prelude to the real war with Western Europe. And Western Europe is well aware of that too. That's why they've reintroduced conscription in various states and so forth. Anyway, that's one scenario. It's how you will finally pull off the Band-Aid on this cycle. The point is that's beyond our ability to influence. All we can do is build on the husk of this thing. So we'll just keep our comments in regards to education. We need piety, consciousness of the past, the dead generations past. It requires a reclamation of discipline. It requires stability. It requires learning how to read again. Long form reading, dedicating the time to that every day. You must return to the telos. This is one of the things that in the cycles of influence, in the circles and cycles of influence, that has completely eviscerated formal education is the telos. Why are we doing that? Well, we have presented ourselves as economic stepping stones. This was a horrible thing to do, and greed undergirded this. We must get back to piety. One of the things that you're starting to see this breakdown is in the college world. And frankly, the college sector has burned a lot of goodwill that it had from people, not just through student loans, but there was a very cynical manipulation of parents to send their children to school and appeals to fear. And I want to address this as well. I wish there were more hours in the day to deal with all of these topics in detail. I will do all of this in good time, but this was a tremendous abuse of parents. The presentation of going to college based off of the fear that your bourgeois child would be a failure. Now, yes, it is true the parents should have been more observant and should not have let the values of their society influence them, but it was an innocent oversight. It was an innocent oversight, and the abuse of innocence, even clunky middle-class parents and their innocence, cannot be excused. And this was in a violation of piety culturally that we accepted this. The scaring of parents in this. And so now the schools, even though the society couldn't elaborate, people, there is something of an anti-intellectualism that undergirds, a lot of, for instance, the homeschool world, once again, not to pick on them, but, and you see that with colleges, right? Probably even more so than public schools, the hated public schools in those worldviews. But part of, where is this coming from? Okay, so earlier I said that a lot of alternative education was fueled by a sophomoric anti-authoritarianism, and I stand by those words. But part of that anti-authoritarianism is because people realize there is this lack of piety, and that there is this manipulation and this taking advantage of fear. Most people couldn't, use these words. Even I'm having a hard time getting my thoughts out. But they know something's up. It almost reminds me of what they say about Joe McCarthy, that Joe McCarthy was actually coming up against what we call globalists in the 1950s, and these one world order people, and he didn't have language to describe it. So he used the only language he had, which was, these must be communists. And he actually wasn't coming up against communists. So for the past 70 years, the left has been defending itself. No, there were no communists, or it was exaggerated. And it could be that McCarthy was right. He was coming up against a traitorous clique. And it could also be that the left was correct as well. The actual left, not the liberals. Nobody cares about them. The actual left and the actual communists and socialists in America were actually being honest as well. That there was no communist plot. There was a plot, but it wasn't from the Politburo. It was from the globalists, but McCarthy didn't have the language. Likewise, various alternative education worlds, they're anti-intellectual and they're bitchy and anti-authoritarian in a very juvenile way, in my belief. But part of that is because they don't have the words and maybe the knowledge of what's going on to explain that. They know, they have a spidey sense about the authorities and the misuse of the authorities of people's goodwill and ignorance and fear, but they don't have the language for it. And I think there's a similar reality here, that people know that piety has been violated, but they don't have the words for it. And so it just plays out in a lashing out at authority and experts in general. So we need to have this return to telos. The purpose of schools is piety, is fundamentally passing on the values and heroes and mistakes, at least intellectually, to analyze them, of the past, hopefully not to replicate them. They will replicate themselves in due course anyhow. But to return to the telos of all education, which is cultural transmission. It's not to get a job. It's not to succeed in some materialistic bourgeois sense. This was a wandering from the proper telos. So we need to return to those foundational principles. The institutions that will survive the collapse have massive burdens to shoulder, and a lot of that will fall on the remaining schools. And what you will see in the decades ahead is that, in a sense, schools will, they will revert to an earlier form, almost a monastic form, from whence they came. And so just like in our world, you see schools have specialized and in fact cut themselves off from their original, in the West, their original monastic foundations, and they've kind of spun off whole aspects which were once very much part of school life and therefore monastic life at one point. You will see that schools will revert to this, and that's exactly what we're building at Apocatastasis. I have not forgotten the thread which I need to resume about elaborating our physical plant and getting a property and what that's going to look like actually day to day. But that's going to look a lot like a monastery, because when this collapse comes, it's going to be like the fall of the Western Roman Empire in various ways. And the people with the discipline and the institutions that continue to carry on are going to have huge burdens to shoulder. And so you're going to see, like I say, formal schools will shrink. Enrollment will go, will shrink down very much. We're going to become like buggy makers after the invention of the automobile. There are still buggy makers, but they are few and far between, but they have continued the trade, and they've continued, more importantly, the art of it. Something similar is going to obtain with schools. So finally, in this return to piety, I advocate 4 insanities that every school ought to implement. And I will be speaking of this more and more and more as we work towards our physical plant. And those 4 insanities are a devotion to the dead, including burial. I see part of a school day and part of the school milieu as having something to do with part of the cemetery, literally maintaining cemeteries, literally preparing bodies for burial. A part of that, maybe it should be the 5 insanities, whatever. A part of that will also be putting schools, at least part of the day, or for part of the work of the day, into old folks' homes. Having the elderly teach the youth, and the youth care for the elderly and accompany them through their golden years. The separation of age groups must stop. We must recover piety, and part of that is going to be changing diapers of old people, clipping their toenails, bathing them, etc., etc. Part of that for the old will be not just sitting around through no fault of their own or through faults of their own. They have much to offer. Everyone has much to offer. The generations have much to offer each other. We must recover this, and we will recover it by encountering each other. The next insanity is postponing what we call high school and college until the late 20s, and replacing that with a lot of physical activity, not just sports, but other things as well, and mythological and liturgical practice and study. These things the youth will benefit from much more. It will have no application whatsoever to capitalism, but that is going away as well. The youth will flower in great physical exertion and great mythological and religious exertion. These things are like mother's milk. It's not for nothing that they are neglected. And then the fourth insanity would be, within the larger context of health and wellness, naturism, nudism, and all of this in the old motto of a healthy mind in a healthy body, and diffusing a lot of unhealthy practices, and also encouraging in the in the ethos of FKK, inculcating to the third point a lot of physical activity and physical health and wellness, but also that spiritual and psychic health that comes through nudity and social nudity, and that vulnerability, the sacramental that nudity offers for trust to grow. It's simply a sign of a cultural vulnerability that we need as we replace this rotting, dying cycle. So that brings us full circle to the Sons of Issachar course. So I encourage you to check this out. We have the schema and the different classes available at ApocatastasisInstitute, and we get way deeper into these topics, journeying, and being taught really by the greatest minds east and west, past and present. This is a tremendous opportunity. The course is $150, and I encourage you to consider that, and then to consider all of our offerings here at ApocatastasisInstitute, an institute for the humanities, an alternative college and high school here on New Milford, Connecticut. With that being said, thank you for journeying with me as we've gone through bad news. This kingdom's over. Maybe that's not so bad, but there were charming things about it. But good news. What's the good news? We have work ahead of us. We have backbreaking sobriety ahead of us. We have backbreaking work ahead of us. We have a lot of iron discipline we have to learn how to recover. But if we do, and we as schoolmen in the remaining schools of the new order going into the next cycle, if we can shoulder this, and please God we shall, with God's help, and with the help of the dead generations past, and with the help of good old virtues like piety and discipline, if we can do that, we will be a benefit to society. We will be a benefit to our vocation and to the dead generations past, whom we have the honor of passing on. So anyway, thank you very much for that. You can check out the Substack article down below, our college links and all that. And with that, I'm going to knock off. Thank you so much, and I wish you a good, educated day. Valete.